Thanks so much for inviting me to share with you this week. And next week, Sophia will be with you, and she is also a deaconess, a brand new and much shinier than I am. So you can impress her next week with all of your knowledge about the order of deaconess and home missioner. So I wanted to start with just making sure we are all talking about compassion kind of from the same definition. Compassion is an action word. It's not just a feeling like sympathy or empathy, but it involves action, and action on a personal level. I found it really interesting to look at the Latin, that it is with suffering. And that compassion means that we meet suffering. And that sounds really scary and unpleasant. And that's kind of the heart of compassion in a lot of ways. But I wanted to start there, that this kind of transcends the empathy and the sympathy that we feel in our hearts and lends us to action in terms of compassion. We can look at the Bible. We can see all kinds of examples of compassion. Most of the Old Testament is about God having compassion on his people, right? Sending manna in the desert, sparing Isaac, all these acts that God has chosen his people and wants to act with compassion towards them. The Psalms is all about David and the other psalmists crying out for compassion, crying out to God, asking for compassion, and being thankful for compassion. And of course, like everything Jesus did, right? Maybe not the turning of the tables, but pretty much everything else Jesus did was about compassion and about an action. I don't know about you, last week we worship at South End with Ann Cover. I know many of you know her. But last week we talked about this top picture illustrates the story of the woman who had a terrible chronic disease. She knew Jesus was going to be in a crowd, and so she reached out. She felt if she just touched his robe that she would be healed. And amidst this group of people, I think this illustration really shows us this crowded place. He feels her touch. And what does he say to her? He says, "Go in peace, your faith has made you well." That kind of compassion, that he turns from a crowd of people who I'm sure were much more important than she was to show compassion to her. And the bottom picture is an ancient depiction of Jesus goes into the temple. It's the Sabbath. And there's a man with a withered arm. And all of those haters, the Sadducees and the Pharisees, are standing there wondering what Jesus is going to do, because to perform a miracle on the Sabbath is a sin, right? It's considered work. I think a miracle should probably transcend some of that. But they're waiting to see, what is Jesus going to do? And what does he do? He heals the man, but also asks that this would soften the hearts of the Sadducees and the Pharisees, that they would see that sometimes the law needs to be superseded with personal compassion and action. So those are two of my favorite stories about Jesus' compassion. When you talk later, I'm sure you can come up with a lot of other things and things that touch your own life as well. And of course, we have to have a JW quote, right? He's huge on compassion, right? I'll read this since it's kind of small. What is the source of that desire to please, which we term compassion? Let us look attentively into our hearts, and we shall soon find the answer. The same apostle that teaches us to be courteous teaches us to honor all men. And his master teaches me to love all men. Join these together, and what will be the effect? A poor wretch cries to me for alms. I look and see him covered with dirt and rags. But through these, I see one that has an immortal spirit, made to know and love and dwell with God to eternity. I honor him for his Creator's sake. Human dignity, that which we share, right? Sometimes we have to look through the outside to see that inside. But yeah, John Wesley gives us a lot of great examples of what compassion looks like played out. In the back, I have a cowboy hat friend who wanted to share something about your covenant group.
Thank you very much. My name's Ed. I know some of you, Covenant Disciple, which is a mystery, these groups meet quietly in little rooms and get together, but they don't sacrifice anything. They don't drink blood. What we do is to deal with these 4 issues that JW addressed for us. And I wanted to say, for our group, every group is different. For our group, we concentrate on 2 things. And that might change eventually, but for now, we practice and talk about then what we've done this week to actively listen to someone's concern, problem, hurt, grief, whatever. And we also encourage and help others through dark places and times. What have we done this week about that? So if you want a place where you can lift up what you're trying to do to act out the gospel in compassion, that's the kind of thing that we do. We invite you to join us. People who are in covenant, raise your hand, please. If you have questions about what it's about, talk to someone here.
Thanks, Ed. Yeah. And that's a perfect example. Every day, every week, we have chances to act compassionately towards others. And being held accountable with a group is a really good way to start that. As Brandon mentioned, I work with Open Table Nashville, and we are a housing and homelessness outreach organization here in Nashville. So some of the, next I wanted to talk about something that's near and dear to our hearts at Open Table. And that's about moving from transactional work with others to relational work with others. I found 2 really great pictures. What do you see in the first picture? Serving food. Okay. And they look pretty happy about it. They also look like super clean to be serving lots of food. So what do you think is in front of them? There's food, and there's like a counter, a barrier of some sort. And then on the other side are who? Poor people, maybe? Yeah. So they're pretty safe in their clean kitchen serving food. How about at the bottom? That is our executive director, Ingrid McIntyre, and a friend. What do you see there? You had 2 people sitting side by side on the same level. I'm sorry?
No barrier.
No barrier, yeah. They both have a bottle of water. They're sharing time together. This is Mike, who was one of the first people that we housed, and Ingrid spent a lot of time with Mike and with other people. We need transactional mercy, and we need transactional compassion at times, don't we? We need to get a lot of people fed. We need to get a lot of children school supplies. We need to do these things, but does that transform our hearts? And does that work towards the kingdom always? From my work, I would say it can, but the difference between maybe writing a check and spending an hour hearing someone's story is very different of how that hits your heart and how it transforms our world, right? We're called to bring the kingdom to earth. We're called to bring God's love to each other, and we can do that from our clean kitchen, spooning up green beans. We can, right? But it doesn't transform us into that kingdom that God calls us to be in. This is a quote that I love. Father Greg Boyle, you may have heard of. He has a ministry in LA called Homeboy Industries, where he helps mostly men who are leaving gangs. They make t-shirts. They have a big company that they run and helps folks break that cycle of gang violence. And he says, here is what we seek: a compassion that can stand in awe at what people have to carry, rather than to stand in judgment about how they carry it. That's a big one, and I have to read it multiple times a week. It's really easy to see someone on the corner asking for money who also has an iPhone and say, well, come on, how hungry are you, right? How do we all get in touch with people in the world with a phone? Can we find out where a soup kitchen is without a phone? Can we connect with friends and family and people who will help us without a phone? It's really easy when we see these things to be judgmental, but we don't know the store. We don't know what that person is carrying. And for me, I think that's been the heart of trying to live a more compassionate kind of life. John Wesley is really wordy, and I'm not. So I had to have a quote from myself. It's really all about relationships. And that's what he was trying to say, but it's all about relationships, and it's all about allowing ourselves into other people's lives and letting other people into our lives in order to transform that world. Brandon asked me to talk a little bit about my own faith journey, and that's kind of an uncomfortable thing to talk about myself, but I put together some pictures to kind of help me walk through it. I was an adorable child. My mother is here, and she can confirm that. I grew up in a suburb of Columbus, Ohio, in a comfortable life, church. I was actually like a super Lutheran. Like, I wasn't just Lutheran, like I was president of the Lutheran Youth Organization, right? I went to camp, I went to Lutheran camp, very, very Lutheran. We had a wonderful church family, a wonderful little town that was a village and became a city. I lived a really lovely childhood. The next picture at the top is a camp cabin at Lutheran Memorial Camp. I loved camp so much that when I was 16, I still went to camp, and they had like a counselor in training. Like, I was too old to be a camper. I was too young to actually have a job, but I had to be there. I loved it. And the last week that I was there, we had 2 churches who sent their youth. One church was the big church in the really old part of Columbus where a lot of rich people live. The governor lived in this area. Their kids all came to camp, and they were adorable, and they had matching luggage, and they were so sweet. The other group was from St. Peter's Lutheran Church, which was in a declined, and down and out part of Columbus. And those kids were also adorable, but came with trash bags or nothing. And this was a shock to me. I had never been around kids like this. I loved kids, right? It was a really hard week. And one of the jobs I was given was to be the wrangler for an 8-year-old boy who was having a really hard time. He was leaving his group, he'd go missing, I'd find him all kinds of places. Under the altar in the outdoor amphitheater. We'd find him like hiding in the kitchen. I didn't know what to do for this kid. And the pastor of the church, a very wise, old Norwegian female pastor, said, part of his trauma is that he's left his younger siblings at home with an abusive parent. And while he's at camp, he's thinking about his younger siblings in that home. This transformed me, and I went and spent several years at St. Peter's in their Saturday school. My mother can attest that she was worried about me driving to downtown all the time. But these people became my family, and that pastor became one of my very first mentors into walking with people, being in community with people, not inviting them into my little white church, not inviting them into my life, but going into theirs. St. Peter's and Lutheran Memorial Camp really transformed my idea of what community could look like. I did all the normal things. I went to college, I went to grad school, I moved to China because I just needed to escape from the world. There's me in China. That again was and I was there as a Lutheran missionary. I forgot about that. Yeah, not doing missionary work because I would be arrested. But time in China with a whole another group of people who I knew nothing about, who I had no language in common with, but people who I learned to love and who loved and accepted me too. I now have a husband and 2 children. I was always interested in being in the ministry, you know? I was always feeling that call, that there was a place for me, but I knew that behind a pulpit was not the place for me. And so early in the 2000s, I discovered the Office of Deaconess and Home Missioner. And this is what called to me. In the middle is our logo. We are called to a lifetime service of love, justice, and service work. We go to seminary. We have a really wonderful community of diverse people across the country who do everything from firefighting to pediatrics to whatever it is I do. It's a real place where I have been able to plug in my theological desires with my service work. At the top, I spent the first 10 years or so in Nashville working with refugees and immigrants, mostly through World Relief, and then also at Vanderbilt. And again, a transformative experience for me. One of my favorite stories, when I was at World Relief, my office was on the second floor, right above the parking lot. And I would always peek out when I heard a car, because I never knew when people were coming to appointments. And I kept rolling my eyes, because a lot of Iraqi and Kurdish families at the time, and a lot of them would get out of the car, the husband would get out of the car, and then open the back seat, and the wife would get out of the car. Like, why does she have to ride in the back seat? Yeah, I rolled my eyes at this probably for a year or more before I thought about asking a friend, phoning a friend, right? So one of my clients, who was an Iraqi man, I said, hey, can I just ask you a question? And I don't want to offend anybody, but I just need to know. Why do you guys make your wives ride in the backseat of the car? And he looked at me just completely stunned. And he was like, Liz, that's the safest part of the car. Yeah, that's the safest part of the car. I've learned a lot from these wonderful, diverse groups of people who I've been able to be with and build relationships with and know where the safe place is. And then there's a picture. I took my mom to a protest once. So this journey that we take towards greater compassion, it involves a lot of discomfort. And I think that's one of the many barriers that we all personally have. When we see somebody asking for money on the corner, it's pretty scary to stop, right? What am I going to say? Is that person going to be friendly? Are they going to be unkind? It can be scary. When we see someone who speaks a different language or have a different culture, it can be really scary too. We question ourselves and we let that doubt and the fear of discomfort come a little too deep. But through questions and finding those people who we can have relationships with, where we can ask questions. I have a really good friend who's Kurdish, and we love to get together and talk theology. And she's like, you've just got to explain this whole bread and blood and whatever this is. What are you guys doing, right? But we can have those conversations for better understanding. There's going to be tears and there's going to be heartbreak. I can really guarantee that. If you're doing this right, you're going to experience some of that. When I was a junior in college, one of the students at my school was carjacked and murdered in the neighborhood I served in. And it was heartbreaking. And it was terrifying. But that's what relationships are, right? They can be heartbreaking and terrifying. We get new and renewed views of the people who are around us, right? We find out that the back seat of the car is the safest. We find out that people have been through a lot more than we would ever imagine, that they are carrying things that we can't imagine how we ourselves would carry. And we get those glimpses into the kingdom that God has called us to be, right? When we can look around our dining room table and see people from lots of backgrounds, people who may not have met each other before, people who are willing to look past what John Wesley calls the rags and dirt into who we are as humans, right? And into what it is that we all want, which is more connection. At Open Table, we talk a lot about rebuilding communities. Our folks who are experiencing homelessness are really divorced from most community. They either are not welcome or don't feel welcome. We look at what Jesus did for women, like the woman who was chronically ill. She was able then to go back and be with her family. Like the leper, like the possessed woman, all of the people who Jesus touched were then able to go back into their communities, into places where they were loved, where they had support. And that's something that we at Open Table try to do too, to help people regain their shared humanity and dignity and be part of our wider world. And I tried to paraphrase this so it would fit on a slide. But this is one of my favorite. It's the prayer of Oscar Romero, which was written in honor of Oscar Romero when he died. He was a priest in Central America who worked really hard to break cycles of poverty and to work towards peace. So I've kind of taken the lines that speak to me most. It helps now and then to step back and take a long view. The kingdom is not only beyond our efforts, it is even beyond our vision. We accomplish in our lifetime only a tiny fraction of the magnificent enterprise that is God's work. Nothing we do is complete, which is a way of saying that the kingdom lies beyond us. So this is what we're about. We plant seeds that will one day grow. We water the seeds already planted, knowing that they hold future promise. It may be incomplete, but it's a step. It's a beginning, an opportunity for God's grace to enter and to do the rest. We may never see the end results, but that is the difference between the master builder and the worker. We are workers, not master builders. We are ministers, not messiahs. We are the prophets of a future that is not our own. And my hope is that we build that future into one that shows compassion in a very broad and deep kind of sense.